Hi there, welcome to IndyCar on the 15th of January. Now, it probably hasn't escaped your notice, particularly if you're, like me, are an independence campaigner and you have some pages on Facebook, or maybe you post on X or some other social platforms, that you might have been getting some really weird messages. I got 6 this morning from unnamed so-called Facebook users claiming that Facebook had suspended my account and was planning to delete IndyCar and offering me the chance to lodge an appeal by following an anonymous link. Now, you might think, yeah, well, that's exactly the sort of thing that Facebook would do, because it is largely governed by the United Kingdom's presumably pro-union Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister under David Cameron. But actually, it looks to me as though these are simply bogus scams. They are just simply, perhaps, maybe they are UK trolls of some kind who are trying to convince us that our pages are locked down and that Facebook is planning to shut them down. But I found no evidence of this, and the best thing to do if you've received any of these messages on your Facebook pages is simply delete them and block the source straight away. Don't open any links, because you may find that you've become infected with malware, and that is going to affect the way you can post online. It might even prevent you from doing it. So anyway, just a warning that the United Kingdom is not above using informational hybrid warfare, so loved by Vladimir Putin and his trolls working very hard to try to disrupt the pages of Western governments. So the United Kingdom, it has its own department for this. It's known as Brigade 77. It's a branch of the armed forces, and it's headquartered down at GCHQ in England. And there they have troll farms which are working their hardest to try to discredit people like me. Now, as well as that, informational warfare has been used a great deal, I notice, in the polls recently, with a baffling range of polling results. Some of them claiming that the SNP will lose 11 seats, some even claiming that the SNP will gain a seat. And if you aggregate all the polls, you actually find that the SNP is probably going to have either just the same number of seats as it has now, or slightly more. And that's opened up an interesting but speculative series of suggestions online that the SNP might end up in a position where it is able to form at least part of the United Kingdom's official opposition. But that is predicated on the Tories having a massive electoral collapse at the next general election, which would mean Labour having a huge unassailable majority in the House of Commons, with the Tories trailing a very distant second. And that would mean that in order for the Tories to have some kind of, or to become some kind of opposition, they might need to do a deal with another party. And the SNP is currently the third largest party at Westminster, and the speculation is that the SNP might end up in a position where it could do a deal with the Tories. I don't think for a moment that that would happen, simply because, A, the SNP is not wanting to go into any kind of coalition with the Tories, even in opposition, and the Tories absolutely would eschew the whole idea of working with the SNP, because they are fundamentally opposed to independence in any form, and would not do any kind of deal with the SNP, whether it was for opposition or whether it had a condition for another independence referendum. So I don't think that is going to fly. Now, in other news, there have been a number of interesting revelations being made by publications such as The Ferret, which is a newspaper in Scotland which digs deep into all kinds of murky shenanigans going on in the political arena. And one of the articles that The Ferret has published concerns the issuing, or I should say the renewal, of fracking licenses to the English and Swiss firm INEOS, which owns the Grangemouth petrochemical plant in Grangemouth. You remember that one, the one that they're planning to shut. Now, it's been suggested in the Ferret article and by some other commentators that the Scottish Government, in issuing fracking licences, or should I say renewing the fracking licence of INEOS, is in some way connected with the closure of Grangemouth, meaning that INEOS is planning to move from the refining of petrochemicals to a model where they start to frack across the central belt of Scotland, and if they're successful, that they set up some kind of shale gas plant somewhere, probably in or around Grangemouth, and part of a new redevelopment. Now, you remember that the SNP government in the past was responsible for, I think you would call it a kind of de facto moratorium on fracking, by making it virtually impossible for INEOS or anyone else to explore for shale gas in Scotland unless they could prove that it would not affect the ground around the shale gas sites. Now, that would mean they would have to prove that it was safe. They would have to prove that there would be no cross-contamination of the groundwater table or the water supply caused by leakage from around these gas wells. Remember that when you shale gas frack, where you're fracturing the sediments below ground, you're also, as well as liberating gas, you may end up liberating some oil as well. And so that kind of stuff can come back up a wellhead and leak out into the environment. So it's questionable whether this suggestion from the Ferret is that shale fracking is going to go ahead. However, it's rather odd that the SNP would choose at this moment to actually reissue a licence to INEOS. And it's a bit puzzling considering that they appear to have kind of just let Grangemouth close. There hasn't been as much of a fight from the SNP as I expected over the closure of the oil refinery, the only oil refinery in Scotland, which is a bizarre situation in itself because Scotland is a massive producer of oil and gas. And yet, when you take away its ability to refine its own fuels, that means it has to buy back all of its transportation and heating fuel from refineries south of the border, and at full market value, full market cost. This is why we're seeing the cost of, for example, heating gas shooting up through the roof, and that's because of free market global economics. Instead of producing our own gas and basically providing it at cost to the domestic supply, we have a government in London which has chosen to sell that gas into the open market and have all of the middlemen and the profiteers take their slice of the cake before selling it back to us at massively inflated prices, claiming that this is all down to inflation. Well, it is down to inflation. It's just that it wouldn't be inflated if the oil and gas had originally just simply been pumped out of the ground here in Scotland, refined here in Scotland, and the Scottish government actually controlled the price of it, which of course it doesn't. So it's mystifying, but not unexpected. The SNP has been forced to backtrack on a number of British plans, including the Freeports plan, which the SNP very carefully tried to spin into green Freeports, the implication of which was that Freeports would be allowed in Scotland only if they met high ecological and pollution sort of benchmarks. In other words, if they could prove that the Freeports were green in some way, that they had a low carbon footprint. But that doesn't lessen the impact on the Scottish economy, because it would make large areas of Scotland around the two sites where these Freeports are located into offshore tax havens that are actually onshore, and that would remove a lot of the taxation which would normally be taken by the British government and then returned to Scotland through the so-called block grant. So I don't see what the benefit of this is to Scotland, and I'm a bit mystified as to why the SNP hasn't fought harder over the Freeports. But then again, it could be simply because the SNP can't fight harder, because they've sworn an oath to King Charles and to protect and uphold the Union, which, as I've said many times before, is the major problem for the SNP. However, when it comes to the general election this year, the SNP will probably win a good number of seats, and they will probably have a seat majority, and they will probably try to start negotiations with the UK if they get this. The question is, will those negotiations lead anywhere, or will the English government just simply say, no, this was a general election, it doesn't give you any right to negotiate anything at all? Now, it's also been badged by the SNP, this election, as a way of shutting the Tories out of Scotland. Now, the Tories, as you know, are a pretty tiny minority here in Scotland politically, especially when it comes to MPs not really having any. And the Labour Party is sort of next best thing when it comes to the Union. And so all of the emphasis from the United Kingdom's Informational Warfare Department, known as the BBC, has been on trying to convince Scotland that the SNP has lost already and we might as well give up and vote Labour because that's going to keep the Tories out of Scotland. Well, no, it's not, because we all know that the Tories are actually the Labour Party now, and Sir Keir Starmer is being, I suppose, feted by the British media as the latest saviour of the United Kingdom. Bizarrely, for a Labour politician, he has decided to basically leave everything that the Tories have already put in place with legislation, including its position on what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in terms of the Houthi rebels, who the United Kingdom seems to have decided to attack. Now, how the United Kingdom has got itself into this situation is largely, I guess, a matter of international politics. The Americans decided that they were going to attack the Houthi rebels because the Houthi rebels were firing some missiles at shipping in the Red Sea, which, of course, is the main shipping route for all Western imports from the Far East. These tend to go through the Suez Canal between Egypt and Israel. And so the Houthis largely saw this as a conduit for bringing aid and bringing weapons and bringing other things to the Israelis. And they thought they could hurt that by making a token gesture of defiance by firing some missiles, largely inaccurate missiles as far as I can see. Well, the West has decided to expend billions of dollars firing the most expensive interceptors they have and then going in and flattening everything in Yemen all over again. Since the Yemeni people have been bombed into oblivion by the Saudi Arabians for the last 10 years, largely with weapons supplied by the United Kingdom and the Americans, you kind of feel a bit sorry for the people of Yemen who's kind of caught in the crossfire here. However, there's a great deal of talk at the moment, particularly in Europe, of the entire West preparing for a new conventional war in Europe against Russia. Now, this is a worrying development, and it's something which the British government seems to be heavily invested in. They've already decided to move large numbers of troops to Eastern Europe. Now, this is something, again, very worrying, but it's fairly typical of what happens in the West when, A, their economies start to fail and their political futures start to look in doubt, is to start a war with somebody that you can easily beat, which is going to boost the number of weapons being made, increase weapon production, produces more profits, more exports, and so it goes on. So we're in a situation now where Scotland is kind of trapped in the middle, where the SNP is unable to really do anything very much politically. The next general election is supposedly a foregone conclusion for Sir Keir Starmer, and Scotland's no further closer to its goal of ending the Union. And somebody had suggested recently to me that what Scotland actually needs is some kind of Republican Party, one which rejects the royal family out of hand, completely rejects the whole idea of an unelected monarch, and rejects the idea of Westminster supremacy in Scotland, which is something which I've spoken about in the past, which doesn't actually exist in the first place. So what are we to make of all this? Do we vote for the SNP in the next general election? Well, as far as I can see, we don't really have much choice. It's either that or the Labour Party, and I know that I'm not going to vote for the Labour Party. So I guess we're all going to vote for the SNP, and things will stay largely the same as they are at the moment. It will, to some extent, shut the Tories out of the seats in Westminster, the Scottish Tories we're talking about here, but I can't see that it's going to force the Tories into talking to the SNP about becoming the official opposition. I think they would rather stick pins in their eyes than do that. So I doubt that is going to happen. So I think it's going to be more of the same. And until we do something at the next general election in Scotland, I can't see anything really changing very much. But I would ask you all to be very aware of the fact that not only is the mainstream media engaged in a massive misinformation war against Scottish independence, now so is the social media platform being polluted by miscreants of various sorts in the guise of Facebook and other major platforms telling us that our accounts are suspended or they're going to be deleted, when in fact it's none of those things. It's not going to happen, and that's why I'm still here, and that's why I'm talking to you today. I haven't been suspended, they're not going to delete my account, and this is just a load of baloney as usual. But it's getting a bit dispiriting to be attacked from all sides like this, even though there isn't any independence referendum going on and there's no campaigning going on. One final word I'd like to say is that it was claimed recently in, I think it was a letter actually in the National, that the independence movement itself, that's you and me, for want of a better word, those of us who are not in political parties but who campaign for Scotland to leave the Union, it's been suggested that it's somehow our fault, the last 9 years of inactivity and the lack of any coherent plan for independence. I take issue with that. The only people who have the power to actually do anything politically were the SNP, the Greens and ALBA, and it is those three parties which have not done anything for 9 years that would actually change the dial on the radio of independence. So we can't get our independence until the political parties link up with the movement and we all move together. And that is what's not happened for the last 9 years. Political parties seem to think that they own the entire campaign for independence, and the rest of us who have been doing all the heavy lifting for 9 years are basically wasting our time. However, we're not wasting our time because it's our job to pressure those politicians. And I keep saying this to everyone who watches this programme. Get on the blower to your politicians, on the phone, on social media, email them directly and demand some concrete action on independence, a plan at the very least for the next election at Holyrood, which would result, if we get a vote majority, not in negotiations, but simply ending the Union and repealing the Union Acts in Scotland, whether or not the majority government of Scotland sits in Holyrood or elsewhere. Now, one of the key things here is that Holyrood as an institution apparently doesn't have the powers over the Constitution that it should have. So either we give our Parliament those powers when we get a vote majority and the people we vote in to Holyrood decide not to sit in Holyrood but sit elsewhere in a new government which will take the decisions to end and repeal the Union. There's so many things here that need to happen and nobody has the courage to do anything about it. And that's always been Scotland's problem. It's not lack of votes, it's not lack of support, it's lack of political courage by the people who are meant to be leading us that are causing our difficulties. And in this cloud of informational garbage that is constantly bombarding us from all sides at the moment, it's easy to lose your focus. Anyway, that is the point of my broadcast, to keep us focused on the task ahead. And that task is not going to happen this year in the general election. This is just going to be a holding pattern to keep things as they are for the next few years. But come that general election in Holyrood in 2026, we really need to get ourselves into gear and not just pressure our politicians, but threaten to not vote for them at all, even starting new parties. And I predict there will be a challenger to the SNP and ALBA and the Greens at the next Scottish general election, because without it, nothing is going to change. Anyway, that's it from IndyCar today, but there's a lot in this programme which I'm trying to give you some balance here. The SNP is unable to do anything about fracking. It's unable to do anything about the closure of Grangemouth. It's unable to do anything about Freeports. It's even unable to do anything about dangerous dogs. We've seen climb downs on that as well. So our government is basically hogtied. It is prevented by the oaths taken by our MSPs and our MPs from doing anything at all at the moment to further the cause. And that is what really needs to change. Anyway, I'll see you all again soon. In the meantime, keep the faith, but just remember, keep pressing the politicians, keep on at them. You want to make yourself a real nuisance. You want to make it unbearable and untenable for them to do nothing, because without that, nothing will move. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Bye for now.